Hey there everyone. Hope that you all have been staying cool this summer, those of you that have to deal with the heat, that is, and who are in the northern hemisphere as well, of course. This is mostly going to be a time lapse of the painting from Miss July, but I do have a few things I wanted to touch on. Mainly the hair, because I used a totally new technique for this. I'm not sure yet how much I like it, but I think I'm going to continue to use it and possibly refine it just a little bit. It makes for much softer looking hair, which is usually a good thing when it comes to painting sexy women. It's also much faster than how I used to do hair, which was pretty much go in and paint every darn strand. I would just keep adding detail and more detail, and it's just not realistic time-wise. So now I really only practice this technique for windblown hair. I'm not sure how well it will hold up when it comes to all the hair falling neatly together, although I imagine that you could make it work. I'll also provide you with the brushes that I used for Miss July's hair and this technique to help you follow along. Give it a whirl and decide if you like this technique yourself. But we'll get into that in just a minute. One of the things I always wanted to try out in Miss July was the sun dappling effect. I think it turned out all right, although it didn't end up quite as striking as I was thinking of originally. That's okay though, there will be more practice where that comes from. So her skin is largely in the pink ranges due to the blues and purples in the atmosphere. But I just wanted to talk about transition colors when it comes to sunlight and highlights. Those highlights are going to be in the yellow tones in most cases. So in my case, the highlights are a very light yellow white. The not quite so strong highlights were a very saturated yellow peachy color. Do a Google search for sunlight on skin and you'll see what I'm talking about. Those sunlight dapples are largely in the yellow ranges. Or if the lighting is really intense and the lightest highlights are almost white, yellow white, then they have a yellowish border around those white highlights. What I mean by that is that if you follow around the edges of the white dappling effect, the next color out will be that yellow peach. Then the flesh tones and pinks, and in this case purples in the shadows. Also keep in mind that where the sun is going through the skin, like in the hands or ears or nose, you're gonna kind of see some blood vessels. Not the actual lines of them, mind you, but the blood will be shining through the skin and making those areas more pink than usual. You'll notice some very strong pinks in her nose, and that's due to the strong light source that's going through the skin and cartilage and making it pink. One of these days I really need to paint some backlit skin where the sun is really intensely going through it. It's a good practice with color and lighting, I think, to get an idea of how light interacts with skin. And if you need to, or want to, wait for the magic hour, which is like an hour before sunset or after sunrise, and hold your hand up to the light and take a photo of it to use as a reference later. This is pretty much precisely what I plan to do as a study one of these days, and I just thought I'd share the idea. So now I'm just going to let you watch some of the painting process for Miss July, and I'll be back with you shortly. Okay, so in this video's description, you will find a link to my website. If you follow it, you will find a link to download the brushes that I use in this tutorial. In that brush set, you'll find 3 brushes. The first is a regular, soft, round brush, but it will get smaller with your pen pressure and have a little bit less flow or opacity as well. The second is my hair detail brush, and if you hover over the brushes once you have them loaded, you can see the names and or a short description of what I use each brush for. The third is a basic soft round brush, just like the first one, but it will not change in size with your pen pressure. It just works at a lower flow the softer you press. So the first thing I'm doing here is using the first brush to block out some basic flowing hair shapes. You can use either of the soft round brushes with your eraser tool to refine the shapes and get them shaped how you want. Mind you, I'm doing this on a new layer. Then I go in with the third brush, the regular soft round brush that says it's for erasing, and just barely press on the pen enough to erase near the ends of the hair. This will simulate the hair thinning out at the ends, because that's what happens. As your hair grows in, your longer strands, there's less of them. I put each new shape on a new layer, and then you can merge them together at the end. The reason I do each one on a new layer, though, is so that I can go in and change the shape using transform, or in this case, transform warp, if I don't like the placement or shape, which is what I do here. Okay, so now I've got some very loose hair type shapies. I merge the shape together on one layer, and then on a new layer, I now use the second brush, the detail brush. This brush will get smaller the softer you press with your brush, but it has harder edges for defining the shapes of the hairs. It works great for big chunks, but also for tiny strands as well. I use a medium color and go in and brush in those basic hair clump shapes on top of the ones we did before. Make sure that you stay somewhat within the shape we made previously. The whole point to having that back layer is to provide some softer edges for the hair. So if you go outside of that, be aware that the edges of that strand, that particular strand, won't be as soft, which is fine and great for smaller strands, but not as great for the bigger clumps, if you're going for that soft effect anyway. I do these one clump at a time, and each on their own layer, in case I want to go in and erase parts of them later. Then I use lighter and darker colors to create more strands and some depth and some highlights. As you can see here, I'm not putting a whole lot of time into each of these. I'm putting a few strands flying here and there outside of the clumps. You can also use the darker color, a darker color, to define some shadows and show which clumps are on top of which other ones. Now I'm going to show you how I made the sheens, and then I'll show you how to add some depth and illustrate the reason why I'm only doing a few clumps at a time. So for the hair sheens, I use a pretty light color and the detail brush on its own new layer, and just kind of squiggle a jagged line where I want the sheen to be. Then I take the smudge tool at somewhere around 80 to 90% strength and use the same detail brush, actually any of the brushes would really work here, and do a zigzag kind of a pattern back and forth so that it's less of a straight line, but keeping the sheen in the same general area. Then I set this layer to overlay, or maybe color dodge or lighten depending on the color of your hair. In this case, overlay I used because it saturated the color, which was good. Then we go back and on top of it, on a new layer, do the exact same thing using that lighter color and the same technique, but not quite as thick as the layer beneath, so that some of that overlay saturation layer shows through at the edges. So I make the line, then I use the smudge tool again to make it more jagged. Then afterwards I'm taking the big soft round brush, the third brush, and I'm erasing just slightly towards the edge of each of the sides of the sheen to make it fade off a bit more at the edges. A bit more of a gradient back to the rest of the hair. Now for some realism, you're going to want to go in and erase some lines through it, because not every hair is going to have that sheen on it. There will be some areas of shadow that won't get hit as strongly by the light or at all. So set the detail brush to a small strand type thickness type size and erase through some of that sheen area. You may want to vary the angles a little bit too, because not all hairs will be completely parallel to one another. I repeat this on all the clumps in various areas wherever the light would hit the hair. Now these clumps look all right. I'm not sure why I keep saying clumps. Now these clumps of hair, the word is starting to sound weird to me at this point. Now these groupings of hair look all right, although they're pretty rough still at this point. So I decide I want these 3 groupings of hair laying on top of the other groupings of hair. So I go back and I create a new layer just above the soft shape that we made in the very beginning, way back, the darker color with the blurred edges. Right above that layer, create a new one, and go through the same process with the detail brush, adding the medium, light, and dark tones to create some detail. Then I take the darker color and the third brush, the same one I was using for erasing, and I add a darker tone just up under where those original 3 groupings of hair were, to add some shadows on the hair beneath and show that they're on top of the others. You could do this with each clump separately, but for our purposes here, I'm just showing you how I created these shadows and the depth to the hair. So I'm not putting as much time into it, but it should illustrate my point, I think. You'll also notice I went back and lowered the opacity on the original layer of shapes. I wanted them there just enough to add some softness to the edges, and it was a bit strong and dark for me, so that was my solution. You can play around with the opacity on your layers for different effects as well. You'll also notice that the sheen on the darker underneath layers, I didn't add a second layer of sheen. I just used the overlay layer for kind of a lighter, more saturated sheen. This works great on layers that aren't getting quite as much light. Now you can go in and add some detail in the form of smaller strands, if you so choose. It looks decent like this, but the more detail you add, the more realism you'll achieve. And all hair has a few stray strands flying about. So I use the detail brush again, set to a much smaller size, and just add in some of those. Make sure you taper off how hard you're pressing with the brush toward the end of the strand. This will make the hair both smaller and slightly more opaque so that it's fading off as you paint it. You can also paint it backwards, which I frequently do, starting at the tip and pressing harder as you get up towards the top of the hair, the root of the hair. You can always use that soft-edged eraser brush afterwards to help erase some of the tip areas to make it fade off a bit more after painting it as well. I make the background black here just so that you can see what I'm doing with the smaller strands, and I had to fix a few areas that had some problems, which illustrates a point that I should probably emphasize. Have your background in place first before you paint the hair. It'll look different on different background colors, and you won't see certain mistakes on one background that will shine through very clearly on another. So that's about it for the hair. Now you can see me using these same techniques on Miss July to create her long flowing locks. I think this particular technique works really well for windblown hair, and it's a pretty fast technique, so it's great when you're looking to save a little time and helps to keep you from trying to paint every little strand. You're better off to paint it in clumps and add the detail to them. I think it'll most definitely save you time, and with that lower blurry layer beneath it all, it adds a really nice soft edge to the hair. I think that is about all I wanted to touch on in this particular tutorial, so I'm just going to let you follow along with the painting process. I hope that you enjoyed Miss July, and I hope that this hair technique works out for you. By all means, give me some feedback. I'd love to hear if you like it. and if it works for you, and if you try it with regular hair that's not windblown and how well that still works. I haven't gotten a chance to try it out that much myself. I just really enjoyed the way that it worked in this particular piece. So I thought I would share the technique with you and the brushes. If you enjoyed this video and tutorial, please feel free to subscribe. I'd love to have you. And thanks very much for watching.